The question that I want to address in today's video is it possible to heal or at least remedy the incredible state of polarization that exists in our modern societies, in our discussions, which is a problem that has been growing and growing and growing. Social media, on the street, cutting families in half, etc., etc. Can we have a dialogue? Is it possible? Well, I think that it is. I think that there's a number of issues on which we're surprisingly in agreement. And here's what I think is the main one, the biggest one. It surprises me how close we are to one another on this issue and how little is done about it at the same time. And this is what I mean. It starts with the story that some years ago I read a book by Rachel Botsman, fantastic researcher. The book is called Who Can You Trust? Well, the story didn't start with that, but I want to start my discussion with that today, because what she uncovered in her meta-analysis of surveys around the world is that public trust in authorities, institutions, public trust in government has been nosediving, falling off a cliff. It is in terminal decline across the board. And this creates a tremendous vacuum. It also creates an incredible broiling anger, a widespread desire to kind of tear it all up, whatever it is. Now, why has trust declined so badly? There's probably lots of reasons, but we seem to be grappling for all kinds of narratives to explain that. Leaping from one pretty shaky conspiracy theory to another, and we try to personalize it and talk it in terms of greed or, you know, corporate executives that are psychopathic. And I think that there's a thread that runs through all of it that's much more banal than all of the pop psychology blame, and much more simple than all of the conspiracy theories, and very well founded. Did you know, for example, that politicians in today's world can spend up to 70% of their work life not conducting the business of politics, which should be in a democracy about listening to people, studying their topic well, drilling deep, and sitting and debating and thinking hard about making laws and policies. 70% of their time has got nothing to do with that. 70% of their time is spent fundraising. And it's not for their salary, they're getting paid. Now that's a staggering amount, fundraising. What are they raising money for? For campaign funds. You probably know everything that I'm about to tell you, but I want to ask the question later on, what are we doing about it? How serious do you think this problem is? Do we accept it? Coming back to what the politicians are doing, they're fundraising to raise money day after day in what they call donations, campaign fund donations. How much money? Well, for example, in this most recent election in the United States, I think that both main parties spent over $15 billion US. I mean, can you imagine some of the other things that we could spend that money on? And in 2020, I believe it was over 20 billion. Here's another interesting stat. In Australia, an enormous proportion of the money donated to politicians, 40% actually, does not have to be disclosed. It's done under the table, but it's legal to donate it in secret. So we don't know where the money is coming from. It's laundered, by the way, so it's not that corporations or labor unions are necessarily directly giving money in the light of day. and selecting politicians that they want to support. A lot of it is laundered through these think tanks, these associated entities. And when you look at who funds them, it's very clear that it's very often like the mining lobby or the pharmaceutical lobby or the big food lobby. Think tanks with innocuous names like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute and the American Enterprise Institute and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't raise the alarm just to hear what they're called, but then when you see the money trail. Now, why do campaigns cost so much money? Because spin is extremely expensive. So when you are in the business of, convincing, influencing the public to think a particular way that agrees with you, or spinning a policy to make it sound like it's done for your own good, it's expensive to do that. It's quite an art and quite a science. PR is complicated. Some of the best psychologists that make the most money aren't there for healing, but are there as PR agents, telling politicians how to do their hair to appeal to a certain demographic, and how to speak and how to not speak. Okay? So their careers are existentially dependent on raising enough money to convince the public. Now, why is that so utterly destructive for democracy? It's not a problem. It's not poisoning democracy. I think it's smashing it. That's because the fundamentals of democracy are based on the separation of powers. Separation of powers means that's the only way that separate entities like the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, they can act as checks and balances, and it actually works. Not all the time and not perfectly, but it actually works. So nobody gets too much power. We also separated out the military from political power. We separated out the church from political power. We haven't separated money, big money, from politics at all. So that aspect of democracy has not yet evolved. We live not in democratic nations, but we live in what I believe to be quite a primitive, embryonic democracy. I sure appreciate where we've come so far, but to think that we've arrived at the zenith of democracy is the ultimate in naive, and I think also quite dangerous. Now, why do I use air quotes when I talk about political donations? I think donations is the greatest euphemism. Okay, it kind of sanitizes what is in fact an act of bribery, solicitation, and a very powerful bribery, in fact, because, and part of the reason why I think generally the public, it's not exactly like we scream from the rooftops. We're not marching in the streets about this. We're not prioritizing. And that may be because it's so normal to donate to political parties, and it's legal. It's not counted as an act of corruption. For instance, when bodies like Transparency International do their studies around the world to find which are the most corrupt and the least corrupt countries, they do a good job, but they don't classify political donations as an act of corruption. And boy, does it corrupt democracy. How is it that, this is why it's bribery, because does anybody think that the most powerful corporate lobbies and labour unions, that they give that money freely from a place of love? Okay, you know, you politicians are just so adorable, and you seem malnourished. I will donate some money to facilitate the process of democracy so I can feel great about myself when I go to bed tonight. And I will ask for nothing in return, of course. Quid pro quo, that lovely Latin term for I scratch your back and now you scratch mine. This is where I don't think it's a conspiracy. It's not like a bunch of Illuminati in hooded robes sitting in a basement surrounded by candles. It doesn't have to be that overt. The power that the power that a very rich entity has is to withdraw the donations at the next cycle. If you want me here at your table, they say, they don't have to say it actually, I need you to show me that you are designing regulations that favor my profit-making interests. From that moment on, a political party or single politician will regulate in a way that's inconvenient to the corporations that pay them at their own risk and at the risk of their careers, but definitely at the risk of losing the next election. And you see how insidious this is when you look at the donations that have been recorded. Most of them aren't, or a lot of them aren't, and you see that the big lobbies give a lot of money to both sides of politics. There's some more air quotes. If you've been suspecting for a long time that the difference between the so-called left and right is becoming increasingly cosmetic, definitely in terms of economic policy, social policy, that's why they're actually profoundly beholden to the same lobby groups that donate the money. Now, what's interesting to me is that there is an agreement on this that spans right across the so-called divide. If there was a march in the streets tomorrow to ban political donations, and if I was there, I fully expect that there'd be some people on either side of me that vote very, very, very differently to me. I think this is an issue that can bring us together. But is the idea of banning all political donations, is that pie in the sky? Because maybe this is why there's been like a public learned helplessness about this issue. And no, it's anything but idealistic. Take, for instance, Sweden. 80 to 90% of the campaign funds come directly from taxpayer funds that are allocated equitably to all political parties. So that if you want to put your thumb on the scales by donating to one side or another, there's not very much room left to do that. And I think that's a much higher quality democracy than what we have in Australia or in the US or in the UK, right, across the Anglo world. And for the most part, Swedish people seem to be a lot more engaged politically, but also less cynical. Not as cynical as we are, and for good reason. There was, in fact, an act brought in called the Tillman Act in 1907 in the United States that banned political donations entirely. Unfortunately, so you can see how possible this is. Unfortunately, this act was never policed, and it was forgotten. It was left there in the books. I don't even know whether it's still in the statutes. I was very excited to see that the current Premier of the state of South Australia, Malinauskas, he has introduced a bill to completely ban political donations in South Australia, 100%. And I read that and I could barely believe my eyes. And in fact, you should see the penalties. Up to a maximum of 10 years jail if you seek to poison the system with money. What an equalizer. If you want to influence how politicians think, you stand in line with everybody else. Rich or poor, we stand in line. We're the same. That's the only way that democracy can make sense. And they're bringing that in the state of South Australia, which I find very exciting. So why can't we do that everywhere else? And can you imagine a world in which politicians aren't having to double speak their way out of the inevitable failure to fulfill promise, because they're serving two opposite needs. They're serving the voter, trying to, but then behind them are the donors who are breathing down their necks, and they can't disappoint them. So they have to use doublespeak and sloganeering and gaslighting whenever they're interviewed by journalists, because they can't tell the truth. There's so much that they can't do and they can't say. They're walking this tightrope. No wonder. Now we can smell the lie. We can smell the bullshit. We can smell the seduction. Most of us can. And no wonder trust has fallen off a cliff. I think that's healthy that we don't trust. There's good reason for not trusting. I think the way out, and it's something that we can all, I think, very widely agree on, is to ban political donations 100%. Thank you.